On behalf of CPE Bay Resistance, our Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, um, I want to welcome you back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, updates on solidarity work that's happening here and across the country, and recent calls to action. So ways that you can plug into ongoing solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. And as usual, share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. And the recordings are available on CPE's YouTube channel. This is the recording of our show on October 11th, 2024. We're at the tail end of a week of action commemorating the start of the genocide in Gaza. Israel has intensified its attacks on Lebanon, which have included a coordinated effort by the Israeli military to target UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, which includes about 10,000 troops from 50 different countries on the border that have been in position since the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon. UNIFIL's Naqoura headquarters have been hit repeatedly this week, with peacekeepers being injured a few days ago after an IDF Merkava tank fired on an observation tower. And in several other instances, IDF soldiers and drones have damaged UNIFIL shelters, vehicles, cameras, and communication systems over the past week. Yesterday, the UN issued a warning to the Israeli military that any deliberate attack on peacekeepers is a grave violation of international humanitarian law and of Security Council Resolution 1701. And UN Resolution 1701 is the 2006 Security Council resolution that established the terms for a ceasefire and long-term de-escalation of hostilities between Israel and Lebanon. This isn't the first time Israel has fired on peacekeepers in Lebanon. In 2006, an Israeli strike killed 4 peacekeepers from Canada, Austria, China, and Finland, respectively. And the condemnation of those attacks by then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, was met with indignation and denial by the Israeli ambassador to the US, and then followed by an American refusal to sign on to a Security Council statement condemning the attacks. The same playbook appears to be in motion again, with denials or silence from Israeli officials and statements from the US that appear to justify these aggressions as part of Israel's attempts to dismantle Hezbollah infrastructure while expressing flaccid, nonsensical concerns that UN personnel should not be harmed. And Israeli social media and Hasbara has been particularly maniacal in response to the global outcry, especially from towards Ireland, which is leading the peacekeeping force, with posts calling for the invasion and colonization of Ireland, and a former Trump advisor on the Middle East, Matthew Brodsky, saying on social media that Israel should be, quote, carpet bombed and have napalm dropped on them. Despite this impunity, and that has been a constant in all of this, the Italian defense minister, who has 1,200 troops stationed with UNIFIL on the border, was quoted yesterday as saying, "Italy and the UN will not take orders from Israel. It was neither a mistake nor an accident." And he was referring not only to the recent attacks, but the attempts by Israel to order UNIFIL personnel to vacate their posts altogether. Michael Higgins, the Irish president, has called it outrageous that Israel threatened UN peacekeepers along the Blue Line, which is the de facto border between Lebanon and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. And he's not alone. And condemnation has come from world leaders and political officials across the globe all day yesterday. The incidents with UN personnel encapsulate a totality of what's at stake here. These troops represent a line of accountability and protection against further human rights violations and expanding war. And Israel is not only ignoring or flouting them, but rather directly attacking and undermining them, while U.S. officials, especially those within the Biden-Harris administration, do what's tantamount to nothing. So how does this factor into Israel's current military strategy in Lebanon? And is that strategy, an invasion strategy in particular, failing? What's happening in northern Gaza as it appears that Israel is looking to fully ethnically cleanse the region? Samar will get into these questions today and reflect a little bit more on what we've learned and what's changed after a year of anti-war mobilizations locally and globally. But before we jump into that analysis, I just want to share a few avenues for our local folks here in the Bay Area to plug into work and to some events that are happening this week. So Again, this is the close of this all-out week for Palestine, ending on October 13th. A reminder that AROC will be hosting a fundraising gala fundraising event rather, tomorrow, Saturday, October 12th, between 3 and 7 p.m. It'll be at the African American Arts and Culture Complex in San Francisco. And you can get tickets by following the link that I believe Annie will be providing in the chat at bit.ly/Gaza Love. Um, on Sunday, the Samud mural community launch is happening at 1:30 p.m. In Oakland at the Uptown Auto Body on 26th Street. There will be, just like the event on Saturday, there'll also be space for kids and activities for children, as well as an opportunity to check out this really gorgeous mural and set of mural drawings. At Uptown Auto Body. And I plan to be there as well as the Gaza fundraiser and hope to see you all in both of those places. Last night we had the first of our discussions on Palestinian resistant history with Helena Coben. Last night it was with Nora Barros Friedman at the East Side Arts Alliance and Cultural Center. It was a great event. Learned a lot about the history of Palestinian resistance and also from Helena's longtime experience working as a war correspondent and in correspondence with the PLO and also in relationship with a lot of Arab leaders, including Rami Khouri, who's a journalist who helped to co-edit the book Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. They'll be talking with Professor Omar Zaja, who's at San Francisco State University at their Casada Center in San Francisco, 518 Valencia, on Sunday between 2 and 3:30 p.m. And then just an opportunity that our comrades at Bay Resistance want to provide for folks that attend these calls to sign up for a one-on-one organizing call with folks from Bay Resistance to get more connected to local Palestine and progressive organizing in the Bay Area. And those are obviously intended for our Bay Area folks. And Annie will be dropping a link to sign up for those in the chat. And if you want to get connected to national efforts to block Trump and defend movements from fascism, our Bay Resistance partners would encourage you to check out See the Boat. And then finally, a major programming note, we actually will not have a PSA next week, so we won't be doing all the updates that we normally do with Summer. Instead, we are going to have a deep dive event, political education event, co-hosted by AROC and Center for Political Education on the war on Lebanon and Israel, U.S. plans for a new Middle East with none other than friend of both AROC and CPE and comrade Vijay Prashad, AROC's own Ryan Elamin, and Lebanese journalist Rukaya Shamsidin, which will take place at the same time, 12 p.m. Pacific on Friday, October 18th. And if you're already subscribed or registered for this event and you're present here, you'll obviously be registered for that. It'll be the same registration information, and we encourage you to share that registration information with other folks so they can join this special event. Really looking forward to what Vijay Rayan and Rokaya have to say and teach us about what's going on in Lebanon. All right, and then finally, just a reminder that, if you can, just let other folks know that they can check us out on YouTube, but also on Spotify, and to check that out and subscribe and rate us too. And yeah, we will have those recordings up after today's PSA. All right, and so without further ado, I want to bring up Samer. Samer, I know you're on the road again somewhere. Great to have you back. I know you're coming from doing another show. Are you cheating on us? But no, just I really appreciate that you're back here. A lot going on in the region and some big escalation, at least in terms of what I mentioned at the top with not unsurprising given Israel's history, but I think relevant to the kind of impunity in which this expanding regional war is being prosecuted by Israel, and also some deep concerns that I know that you have about what's happening in northern Gaza that you are gonna share with us today. So, floor is yours, and thanks for having being back with us again.
Thanks, Thomas. Always great to be here. And I was just on another show, but I was thinking about you the whole time, I swear. It's really good to be here with you all today, particularly I think this week has been a really heavy week for a lot of us, uh, holding a lot of grief and a lot of anger, which hasn't been made easier for all the folks who are also here in the Bay Area. Hearing fighter jets scream overhead every day has been a real worsening aspect to that. But that's why I feel very grateful to be in community with all of you. So thanks for listening to my little updates. I will just jump right in because there is a lot. The official death toll this week has gone up by over 300 in Gaza. It's been a absolutely brutal week for reasons that we'll get into. Along with, we've been talking for weeks now about whether the invasion of Lebanon is really going to like happen. We're sort of in a weird interstitial space at this point where it has technically happened. I think Israeli forces have moved in about 2 kilometers or so in across the Lebanese border, but it's still quite small for reasons that I think we'll get into shortly. I skipped Rafah this week just because there wasn't any specific news there. There are a number of things happening in Rafah, but in the interest of getting through everything, I did want to talk a little bit about central Gaza, where in both Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, there were some really intense bombardments from the Israeli Air Force. Specifically on, if folks remember, we've talked many times about the shrinking humanitarian zone in Gaza that now constitutes about 20% of the overall territory. Most of that is in Khan Yunis, and that is the area that once again has now been bombarded. So another 20 or so Palestinians were killed in that bombardment, plus an additional 30 or so at another school complex, which has, become quite a consistent pattern a little further up in Gaza in Deir al-Balah. But the big news, obviously, in Gaza this past week has been the encirclement and evacuation orders that are being issued in and around Gaza City, a lot specifically in Jabalia, where a large contingent of IDF forces have sort of cordoned off a major area of the city and have ordered mass evacuations in some areas. In other areas, they've done the exact opposite, a sort of like encirclement besiegement where no one is allowed to leave. So if folks have been attending these for a little while, the strategy behind this might sound a little bit familiar. This is the so-called generals plan that we've been talking about for a few months now, that Israel has been publicly sort of testing the waters on whether, this sort of action would be accepted by the broader international community and particularly the United States. And now it looks like it's still pretty early stages, but it looks like that general's plan is starting to be implemented. And the plan here, again, is basically just to empty out northern Gaza, right? The idea is the 400,000 or so people that are there right now, they all need to either leave or be killed. And that's why, Truth Out is referring to it as an extermination zone, basically, that these Palestinians are trapped. The ones who try to leave may very well be assassinated in their attempt to leave, and the ones that stay will be considered de facto combatants. And so this is the same sort of way that Israel says, like, oh, we've killed this many fighters. They include people that refuse to leave evacuated zones like this. And there are obviously a lot of reasons, including some that we talked about just last week around Palestinians with disabilities that can't or won't leave uh, evacuation restricted areas like that. And so we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the next week or so, but it's looking very bad. It's looking very, very bad. There's a reason that I think the United States picked this week, as Thomas was mentioning earlier, to talk at the United Nations about Israel's responsibilities to maintain Gaza's territorial integrity, because it seems very likely that what we're seeing now is a sort of um, conceivably final stage ethnic cleansing campaign to basically empty out the north, to turn it either into a military buffer zone or to uh, reestablish settlements. It's very hard to say. It's worth noting that the general's plan has a lot of detailed information about getting all the Palestinians in northern Gaza out, and mentions nothing at all about what happens after they're all gone. So there's no plan for the reintegration of Palestinians into northern Gaza, for example. So that's a very worrying sign. We're seeing, as we were in the early days of the Israeli assault, that uh, a lot of the sort of evacuation pressure is being placed through the besiegement of hospitals, in particular. The biggest hospital in northern Gaza right now, the Kamal Adwan Hospital, is currently being besieged and issued with evacuation orders. The um, doctors at that hospital, as we've seen in a number of other hospitals, are refusing to leave. And they're not just refusing to leave sort of on a principled position that it's, they have a duty of care to their patients and they're not going to leave their patients to die, but also as a sort of strategic move to get enough international pressure on this latest hospital assault to force Israel to sort of reconsider. So I did put a link in the slides for the latest petition on that has been circulating to sort of pressure the US, to pressure Israelis to stop the besiegement and assault on the Kamal Adwan hospital in particular. So I did want to, given that we are at the sort of 1 year mark now, I think Monday, if I'm not mistaken, this coming Monday will be 1 year since Israeli forces moved into Gaza this time around. So, uh, it behooves us, I think, to think a little bit about what has happened, reflect on what this year has been and what it implies for what the next year will be. So I wanted to pick out a few things that I read this past week that I found to be particularly useful as I've been sitting and thinking about these things. One, this Mother Jones story that covers some of the findings from the Cost of War Project, which is a Brown University endeavor to identify both the human toll and the financial toll of various wars. They've obviously been focused a lot on Gaza lately. And that is the source of some of the news stories you may have seen this week about the United States' record-breaking aid to Israel this past year, $17.9 billion. You can see on the chart here that even adjusted for inflation, this is the largest amount of military aid the United States has ever given, well, at least has in the past 70 years given to Israel, 60, I think. And that includes the 1973 October War, which was like a hot war with three surrounding countries. Still, even in that circumstance, the United States has given more military assistance to Israel just this year for this like one-sided, genocidal campaign. The death count is something they also get into in quite some detail, uh, thinking through what the more realistic figure here would be. And unsurprisingly, of course, the official count of 40,000 some odd is inconceivably low, and the real number is at minimum around 3 or 4 times that, and likely to be significantly higher. There are two other like sort of looking back and looking forward articles that I would definitely recommend you read, particularly Noura Arakat's article in The Nation, which I think was just beautifully summarizing everything that happened in the last year. It's a hard read, but it's a beautiful read, so I would definitely recommend it. And similarly, the Abdul Jawad Ahmad article in Mondoweiss, I think, is a really nice look at not just the past year, but the past 100 years and what we can expect given sort of everything that has happened before. Um, Moving into West Bank stuff, there were a series of settler attacks and IDF incursions, including like the ongoing stuff that's happening in Jenin. But rather than talk about those in detail, I thought it would be more useful to sort of take this sort of zoomed out look. Al Jazeera has a incredible article they put out this week mapping all of the settler attacks that have happened over the past year. You can see, in this sort of small chart on the middle of the screen for those of you that are watching, that basically you see the number of settler attacks in the West Bank charted out by month. Before October of last year, there were about 100 settler attacks per month. And then In the month of October of last year, that number spikes up to 233 and then goes back down every month after that, but not back to the level it was before. So ever since then, there has been a heightened number uh, of settler attacks across the entire West Bank. There's a series of other sort of investigations and graphics into this in this article that I think are really worth looking into. So I would recommend doing that if you find yourself with the time and the inclination. But getting into some of the bigger questions here on Lebanon, I think there's a series of big questions around what's been happening with the scale of the offensive and how it's been sort of running into protracted resistance that has, I think, really derailed probably what was, based on what we can understand from public statements, what was the Israeli plan for the occupation of Lebanon up to the Litani River. And so what we're seeing, I think, is a continued escalation from where we were a week ago. Obviously that one like bombardment campaign, nothing has quite matched that in terms of single day violence. But the series of airstrikes across Lebanon, I think, is easy to interpret as a sort of fallback measure, given that the ground offensive doesn't seem to be working. And so I think we'll probably continue to see a pretty large scale aerial strikes in the absence of a successful ground campaign. The idea here being in a very similar way to the way that the United States has historically done counterinsurgent operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan is, you start with the airstrikes to sort of weaken defenses. And then once those defenses are more weakened, then you feel more comfortable sending in ground troops. Given the sort of way that Hezbollah's military architecture is embedded into the landscape, this doesn't seem like it's going to be a very effective strategy for a whole host of reasons. We'll come back to some of that, I think, in a little bit. But, the other, I think, really big implication of the protracted aerial strike strategy of the Israeli Air Force is with the loss of Hezbollah's previous top leadership, we are probably seeing changes in high level strategy as new leadership assumes those roles, right? Like there are, of course, contingency plans for who takes on those responsibilities when people are assassinated or otherwise incapacitated. And I think an example of that personally would be these rockets that Hezbollah launched at Haifa just this past week that circumvented Israel's missile defense systems and hit the city directly. Now, this is the first time, to my knowledge, at least definitely in this round of conflict, like in the past year or so, that Hezbollah appears to have directly targeted infrastructure that isn't military infrastructure. So they weren't, I think they weren't like trying to hit a particular military base. They were hitting Haifa to hit Haifa. That is something that Nasrallah, I think, was himself kind of singularly opposed to. I think he had a more conservative orientation around what would be acceptable in terms of military engagement with Israeli civilians. And with Nasrallah gone, obviously that question is now an open question in a way that it wasn't before. And this speaks to the sort of increased risk caused by the idea that Israel can successfully launch a campaign by this by just sort of decapitating the leadership of the organization. That's not really how you win anything, right? It just results in new people taking those positions and those people having often sort of more radical orientation about what's acceptable and what's conceivable in terms of military strategy. So I don't think we've seen a huge departure from what they've been doing historically. I think Hezbollah seems to very much be in that same sort of cone of, I think they call it strategic patience or strategic restraint or something. The idea being that they're doing like the bare minimum to keep Israeli forces occupied and out of Gaza. So that is largely the case, although obviously with ground troops in Lebanon, those dynamics are changing pretty rapidly. So the fourth division seems to be the IDF like preliminary ground force. They're the ones that I think have been taking those hits. If folks have seen the sort of Hezbollah ambushes on IDF positions in Lebanon that have forced them to retreat, it's the fourth division. Incredibly, this is the same group of people. Well, might not be the same literal people, but the same division that invaded Lebanon in 2006 and got, handily defeated then. So I think there's probably an idea like there's a desire for like rebuilding their, saving face and rebuilding their reputation. It's not going very well for, reasons I touched on a little bit last week. But if folks want to talk a little bit more about why the IDF, is so capable in terms of like bombings and assassinations, but their ability to sort of engage on the ground is so bad. We can get into that if folks are interested in talking about that. The other, of course, fascinating development this last week that Thomas also touched on a little bit was the engagement between Israeli military forces and UN peacekeepers, particularly the Irish peacekeepers in UNIFIL. Um, there's a wild thing happening right now where the IDF is literally setting up military forward operating bases right next to UN deployments. And part of that is a sort of intimidation strategy to get the UN peacekeeping forces to leave. And the other part of it is, in like the great historical ironies, human shields. They're literally using human shields um, as a way to prevent Hezbollah rocket attacks against those forward operating bases. And Hezbollah has, in fact, put out a statement saying that they wouldn't fire on Israeli positions that were close to UN peacekeeping forces because of the risk of hitting peacekeeping forces. So those forward operating bases by the IDF are actually just sitting there totally uncontested right now because the UN obviously has no capability of forcing them out, and Hezbollah won't attack them, so they're just there. Uh, there's also this article from the U.S. Naval Institute, of all places, that's certainly worth a look, that goes into what happened in the giant aerial assault that Israel did that killed Hassan Nasrallah a couple of weeks ago. There's a number of things in this article that are really interesting, but the high level takeaway that I was very shocked by was that they compared Israel's use of 1,000 pound, 2,000 pound, and 4,000 pound bombs to the US's use of those bombs in Iraq. And consider the decade that the United States was in Iraq and all the damage that they caused, and like the level of bombardment across that entire very large country. And uh, the U.S. Naval Institute assessed that Israel dropped more like 1 ton plus bombs on Lebanon in a matter of 3 hours than the US had dropped in all of Iraq in the entire military campaign history there. And not just more than that, but 3 times as many. Just to give you a sense of like the extent to which that campaign to assassinate Nasrallah was a very like, they crank those dials up to 15. Um, Meanwhile, Israeli forces are putting up flags in Lebanese territory, which again, obviously a violation of international law, but uh, it's just a bad sign for, again, like you hear Israeli officials talking about the annexation of South Lebanon in ways that, when you see flags being put up like that, is a bad sign for what that actually might actually turn out to be. Um, yeah, there's more here about the sort of ongoing engagement between the IDF, Hezbollah, and UNIFIL as sort of like the three military forces that are operating in the south. But uh, the bigger piece here, I think, is one that Israel has been confirmed to be using depleted uranium in its bombing of Lebanon. So that's a internationally banned chemical warfare, uh, and yet it is ongoing. Depleted uranium causes like this, a whole set of generations long problems, which is something that happened also in 2006, incidentally. So we are seeing a sort of repeat of that. Uh, I think this assault on Lebanon in particular was the sort of straw that broke the camel's back for Macron and France, which often sees itself as Lebanon's colonial protector. And so Macron this past week made a very strong statement about the entire global community stopping all arms sales to Israel. Like he actually called for an arms embargo. which led to unsurprisingly backlash from within his own sort of center right party, but also from Israeli officials and things. But a big shift, right, from the same person who made pro-Palestinian demonstrations illegal following October 7th of last year has come to this point. Just gives you a sense of how the window has shifted, I think, over this past year. Um, I thought these two articles were just interesting to look at if you wanted a little bit more context. The Guardian does a really good job, I think, here of showing Israel's various operations in Lebanon, both its invasion and occupation in the 80s, the invasion in 2006, and what's happening now, and sort of lays out some of the similarities and differences between them. That is quite interesting. And then, of course, the specter of Gaza hanging over Lebanon is no small part of this. Like, it's not surprising, I think, to any of the folks listening in here, slash, who have heard any of these conversations previously about how part of what was happening in Gaza was Israel reestablishing kind of global norms of what would be acceptable. We are seeing a level of bombardment and assault on Lebanon that would have been inconceivable a few years ago. But now, because it's sort of been normalized by them doing it in Gaza, that same level of willful sort of war crime committing is happening with very, very little accountability, because that accountability was blown to smithereens in Gaza. So the deliberate targeting of schools and hospitals, the like wanton assault on refugee camps, and the sort of like minimal evacuation orders and things like that are all things that I think are a direct byproduct of those sort of eroding norms coming out of Gaza, right? And Israel's ability to sort of engage in that way with no accountability. And so the failing of whatever thin international order existed before the assault on Gaza is now evaporated. And we're seeing that in Lebanon. And there's real fear, both from sort of broad international community folks, but also um, from the like people in Lebanon who are like, oh, fuck, like we are going to experience what the people in Gaza had experienced, and they're right to worry about that. We are already talking about 1 million displaced people and widespread bombardment. So that's not an unreasonable thing to think. Meanwhile, we are still waiting for Israel's retaliation against Iran, which is coming. There's no question that it's coming. It's just a question of when and how. Um, it's worth like I was absolutely stunned by this NBC article about how U.S. military officials said two different things here. One, they said we have no idea what Israel's going to do because no one is willing to tell us. Um, and literally in the first paragraph of this article, American military officials have discussed possibly supporting Israeli retaliation with intelligence or airstrikes of their own. So apparently the US military is considering like, well, shit, if the Israelis are going to bomb Iran, we might as well bomb Iran too. So like the hawkish portion of the military establishment, there are, believe it or not, more hawkish and more dovish portions of the military establishment, are very keen on this idea of being part of that bombardment exercise and using it as an opportunity to sort of like knock Iran out as a US regional foe. Um, and even though the US wants to engage in this bombing campaign, they've been shut out. And so they're upset at the idea that like they can't actually participate because the Israelis won't share anything. So you end up in a situation where um, the Biden administration basically is totally blindsided by what might be coming. And again, as we've seen before, there are different tendencies within the Biden administration. There's obviously a portion of folks there, including Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein, who are sort of willfully doing this and using the language of like, oh, we don't know what's going on as an excuse to let Israel do whatever it wants, because if the U.S. doesn't know, then there's plausible deniability. But there does also seem to be a level of what's happening here that feels like it's a consequence of a worsening relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And I do think that that is happening, even if it's happening in a way that feels a little bit thin. Um, Meanwhile, I think the other uh, big Iran development this past week is that the foreign minister of Iran is in Saudi Arabia, talking about ceasefire prospects in both Gaza and Lebanon. Remember that these two countries were mortal enemies for about a decade, until a China brokered peace agreement earlier, just last year, I think. Um, and uh, yeah, it's a fascinating development that I think really speaks to Saudi reading the tea leaves on um, where sort of global positioning is, right? And so the fact that Saudi Arabia and these other Gulf countries that have historically seen Iran as their number one enemy are saying very publicly, like, we won't allow US or Israeli forces to use our airspace to strike Iran, is like a new thing. It really is a new thing. And how much of it is based on the fact that obviously um, solidarity with Palestine is a really critical issue for their constituents, like for the people that live in those countries. And so if they want to hold on to their crowns and fancy chairs, they have to do this on some level. But I think it's also sort of a noted self-interest that they don't want to be involved in a regional escalation that would put their own sort of energy infrastructure at risk. Um, so uh, in all of this, where is the US? Um, there is a new Bob Woodward book coming out very soon called War, I think, that covers the Biden administration's engagement on both Ukraine and Gaza. And there's some fascinating little tidbits in here. We're seeing, for example, like again, um, a lot of Biden expressing anger at Netanyahu and then doing literally nothing with it. Um, I think like it's described as, like some Biden administration official says, like, we're in a really low place with Israel right now for understandable reasons. And in the same breath, like, it don't think it actually is going to change our willingness to like provide weapons or defense. Um, and so like, I don't know, it's a super interesting like these tidbits that are coming out from that book are very interesting, and I would be very keen to read that Bob Woodward book. But it sort of like speaks to the total incapacity of the Biden administration to move anything, anything as it relates to what's been happening in Israel. And this other like political investigation that talks to some senior White House officials, um, specifically getting into the idea that recognizing that the US international reputation is now in the trash, right? It's in absolute tatters. There's a little piece there near the end where they say that White House officials, you know, trying to press human rights issues with foreign counterparts aren't able to do it because the damage is done, right? And they say the world just doesn't trust us on this anymore, which, like, why the world ever trusted the United States on human rights issues, different question. But uh, just like the cost that the Biden administration has borne by its unequivocal support of Israel is something that's really quite a marvel to behold. And then in the context of all of that, you see Biden at his press conference last week where he said, no administration has helped Israel more than I have. None, none, none. In the context, like that was, I think folks, if they didn't watch the whole thing, that was in response to a reporter asking Biden if Netanyahu was trying to sway the US election against him. So for like everything that the United States has done and for everything that the Biden administration specifically has put on the line to support Israel, the Israeli government is actively trying to get the Democrats out of office in the November elections. And so a reporter asked Biden that. Biden said, I don't know, maybe, and then was like, no administration has helped Israel more than I have, and Netanyahu should remember that, like he owes me. And obviously, I don't know, it's just so sad to see um like Joe Biden grovel like that. Like, ugh, like, not that I have any respect for that man, but like, man, have some respect for yourself. It's just, yeah, it was a little bit brain breaking to see that. And then, the usual sort of leaks to Axios and Barak Ravid, the former IDF propaganda officer who gets these sort of like leaks from the White House that are always just Biden administration trying to communicate something. So again, we're seeing more of those about how the White House doesn't trust the Israeli government. And in the same breath saying, like, we don't know what the Israelis are going to do in Iran. And if we don't know what the Israelis are going to do in Iran, then we can't guarantee that we would defend Israel when Iran counterstrikes. And literally the next line in the article is, but we would probably provide whatever defense Israel needs if it came to that. So like it just shows you the sort of utter incapability of setting a single line as it relates to what's happening. And part of that is, the news that came out this week that one of the tactics that the U.S. is trying to get some sort of control or accountability over these Israeli strikes and these coming Israeli strikes in Iran is that they might give compensation packages for not bombing certain buildings. So as long as, for example, the Israelis don't target Iran's nuclear infrastructure, then the U.S. will pay them to not bomb Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Um, it's a bit wild to see, and it's also worth noting what they consider to be an acceptable and unacceptable target. You would think, again, in accordance with sort of basic international law, that those targets would be limited to Iranian military sites, similarly to the Iran attack on Israel, which focused specifically only on military buildings. But the US does consider Iran's energy infrastructure to be an acceptable target, or at least it didn't list it as something that was an unacceptable target. So the possibility, very high possibility of an Israeli airstrike hitting, um, energy production or energy distribution facilities, oil fields, gas fields, uh, is a very extant concern that could obviously lead to a very quick regional escalation. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Something may be brewing on that. I would have thought it would have happened this week. It obviously didn't, but it might well happen next week. Meanwhile, the U.S. at the first time, at least in this round of, like in this past year, taken a more hardline tack on actually, like they, the statement put out um, at the UN Security Council actually specifically says, you know, um, Israel is issuing an evacuation order, but Palestinian civilians have nowhere to go. They note like the 1.5 million displaced civilians, which is an undercount, but whatever. They talk about Israel blocking aid, which is a thing that the U.S. has historically not been willing to admit. Um, and they defend UNRWA. All of these things that the Biden administration has never taken attack on that before in that particular way. So it's fascinating to see that. I was a little bit surprised by it. They call for Israel to follow those two UN resolutions that Thomas mentioned at the top. And one of the reasons that they're doing that, I'll come back to these in a moment, is just um, the shifting popular narrative around what's happening. I think particularly now that the 1 year anniversary of October 7th is over, like that sort of um, the like strategic communications around centering Israeli lives over this past year becomes increasingly difficult to do that. Like the popular conception of who the victims here are is clearly rapidly changing. This YouGov Economist poll, I think, really speaks to that. The first time I've ever seen Democrats expressing more sympathy with the Palestinians than anybody else. Um, there has been a lot of movement from only sympathizing with Israelis to sympathizing with everyone, and now it's moving from that to sympathizing specifically with Palestinians. So it's clear that the Biden administration, in its concerns about Harris's electability, particularly in Michigan, for reasons that we talked about last week, is trying to do some sort of like little pivots here. And as always, the question that we come back to in these PSAs, how much of this is anything beyond rhetoric? So they've made a much stronger condemnation at the UN. Does that mean that they'll actually use any of the many levers they have at their disposal? That seems very unlikely at this stage, but circumstances can change, right? This is how it starts. Whether we're able to get it beyond where it starts is an open question. On the BDS front, another ship with arms bound for Israel has been denied docking. So this time in Malta, the union there has specifically said that any vessel carrying weapons for Israel will not be allowed to dock in Malta. A huge and great development. and then a really quite powerful statement from the Condé Nast and New Yorker writers unions that I would definitely recommend giving a read if you have a moment. For the ICJ, in addition to Bolivia now joining the other, I believe, 9 countries that are involved in South Africa's genocide case against the ICJ, we're now seeing, the long-awaited South Africa's new evidence being presented, which I think is supposed to happen very shortly. And then, with all of that, just to sum up, the encirclement of Gaza City and Jabalia is looking like that general's plan we have long feared does seem to be coming into focus. Whether there is still an opportunity for that to stop is going to be highly dependent on what kind of pressure can be exerted and how, particularly given that Israel is obviously really tangled up in Lebanon right now and how that changes the calculus. Hard to say. It might accelerate and it might block. But what is going on in Lebanon, I think, is clearly not going well for the IDF invasion forces. It's clear that the IDF just isn't equipped for a kind of ground campaign that they thought they would be able to do. And in fact, what we're seeing is a more or less carbon copy replay of what was happening in 2006. The fact that they've only been able to advance about 2 kilometers, I think it's very, very telling. We are still waiting for the Iran response. It's hard to know what's going to happen with that and when. Whatever it's going to be, it's probably going to be really bad. But it's, again, there's so little we know here. And meanwhile, I think the Biden administration is just really, really floundering with the sort of absolute like moral and political crisis that their position on Israel has created. How that affects the sort of last month of Kamala Harris trying to shore up some support from the progressive left, hard to say whether she'd be willing to move or not. But it's clear that she's against a stronger move, like she's up against a stronger and more unified progressive left than even existed a month ago. So I think it's very telling that as the political winds shift, I think we have to invariably see some political shifts on some level, particularly as we build local power. Uh, Wanted to re-up a couple of the events that Thomas mentioned at the top. AROC's fundraiser is tomorrow at 3 p.m. So would love to see you there. I do think that there are tickets available. So please come say hi if you do end up going. And then I heard great things about the CPE event on understanding that the book launch event on understanding Hamas and why it matters. So I absolutely plan on going to that also on Sunday. So hopefully I will see you there. And then of course, really keen for the Lebanon deep dive next Friday. And if you want to learn about any of the other events that are happening, there are so many this month. Please check out the AROC calendar. If you want text alert updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And then check out the PAL Media Tracker at palmediatracker.com for access to the articles that inform this analysis. And thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, as always.
Samrat, thanks again. We've passed this, ostensibly the date of the anniversary of sorts, and I appreciate all the articles you laid out for us that are doing some of that reflection. Something from last night that I think feels in line with that was that there was an anti-war organizer, a longtime anti-war organizer, who at some point, mentioned that the conversation had, and the past year had really sort of challenged her thinking around violence and particularly around liberation movements, right? And the squeamishness that some sectors of the anti-war movement have had around really sort of embracing that question and contending with the question about justified sort of liberation, violence and liberation struggle, right? And I think Helena gave a really good response to that. It also made me think just about how much shifting of thinking has been on display in the public fora. Recently, Ta-Nehisi Coates being on this book tour of sorts, which I think he's been very explicit about the sort of change in his thinking that happened around Palestine. I read a little bit of Rashid Khalidi's interview and maybe felt a little bit of this sort of numbness or maybe sadness with him leaving Colombia in this way. And then, of course, Nora's article, which very much hits it on the head around what has changed and what will never be the same again. It feels like we'll be reading more of these pieces. But I'm also really curious as we go into the next few weeks about how people who have had an eye on this region for a long time, and maybe this is going to be in the Bob Woodward book, how their thinking has changed from the last few decades around what's possible and what's not in the Middle East. I think Nora's article lays it out about the potentialities of what is possible now that wasn't before, but also like how much has significantly changed. And I hope we'll get into this a little bit with VJ next week. Yeah, and I don't know if you have anything to say on that, but
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, that's a lot. I think like it's funny because you preempted the thing that I was going to say as we were talking about like the squeamishness around violence and stuff. Because I was listening just this morning to the Ta-Nehisi Coates interview with Trevor Noah. You know, that one picked up, I think, a lot of attention because he mentioned like if I was a child in Gaza, how would I have felt when
yeah,
that like wall came down for the
exactly.
first
Yeah.
time? But the other thing he said that I found very striking was, you know, he talked about Nat Turner and the slave rebellions, right? And the violence that came from those slave rebellions. And nobody now really focuses on that as like the salient aspect of the slave rebellion. They see it, I think, correctly as a inevitable byproduct of, you know, centuries of subjugation. Um, and so I do think like this moment, you know, as we pass the 1 year mark and how we think about what happens going forward and how this sort of whole story starts to solidify in its actual framing, like how will history remember this period? We're seeing that adaptation happening in real time, right? And obviously this isn't a thing that's unique to Palestine or the United States or the slave rebellions, you know, like I often find myself thinking about what happened in Kenya with like one of the very early colonial anti-insurgency operations, right, was against the Mau Mau in Kenya, which again, I think at the time, the whole world in this very deep moral panic about, oh, look at all the violence that the Mau
Mm.
Mau have done against British, you know, like British families living in Kenya. No one thinks about that anymore, right? Because like what we remember is Britain's colonial violence in Kenya. And I think we have the distance and perspective to see that. And of course, we have the distance and perspective to see that in Palestine. But uh, it's slowly catching up in the sort of national imaginary in a way that I feel like is really important.
Yeah, yeah, it's something to be living in real time, and being in the midst of that transformation and being in some ways agents of that as well. So again, I'm gonna reshare the screen as we close out. We'll answer some of the questions that are in the chat as we close out and play some music. But just a reminder that next week it will not be a regular PSA. It will be our event with Vijay Prashad on with a deep dive on Lebanon with Rayan El Amin and Rakaya Shamsuddin. It should be a great conversation, and a look at a little bit at the recent political history as well as, very much an understanding of what's going on right now. So, looking forward to having you all there. Please share out the link, and we'll have the recordings up later today. So, thanks for joining us, and see you next week.